They said humans would beg. They said fear would make us kneel. That threats would break us. That silence meant we'd already surrendered. They were wrong. Dead wrong. When terrorists seized the station and broadcast demands to every corner of known space, humanity didn't send diplomats. We didn't send apologies. We sent something else entirely. Something built quietly for exactly this moment. Something no negotiation table could ever stop. What happened next wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't even war. It was humanity's answer to anyone who ever thought terror could work. The distress signal hit Sector 7 at 0300 hours station time, and within minutes every screen on Kepler Relay Station lit up red. A group calling themselves the Ashen Hand had taken the station, 300 civilians locked inside the docking ring, and their leader, a Voss warlord named Dresk Karnholt, wanted the galaxy to watch. He got his wish. His broadcast reached every allied world in under an hour. Behind him, hostages knelt in rows, hands bound, faces pale under the flickering emergency lights. Dresk stood tall, chest puffed out, speaking slow and deliberate like he'd rehearsed this 100 times in front of a mirror. "Humanity," he said, "you built this relay. You staffed it. You will listen now, or your people die one by one, broadcast live, until the Coalition Council gives us what we want." What the Ashen Hand wanted was simple and ugly. Full withdrawal of human fleets from 3 border systems, release of captured extremist cells, and a public apology for what Dresk called human arrogance in refusing to bow to his faction's demands over the past 2 years. Every other species in the coalition braced for the usual routine. Negotiators would scramble. Diplomats would fly in. Someone would blink first, usually the side with more to lose, and Dresk knew humans had a station full of civilians to lose. That's what he was counting on. That's what every terrorist counts on, that the fear of losing lives will make the strong side act weak. But something felt off almost immediately to the other coalition species watching the feeds. Human channels went quiet. Not chaotic, not panicked. Quiet. No emergency press conferences, no tearful ambassadors, no public outrage campaigns. Just silence, cold and total, from every human world at once. On Earth, in a bunker beneath what used to be Colorado, a woman named Admiral Elena Reyes watched the same broadcast everyone else did. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a phone to call the council. She turned to the officer beside her and said 4 words that would later become legend across a dozen star systems. "Get me the Vipers." Nobody outside a very small circle knew what the Vipers were. Not the council, not the press, not even most of the human government. That was the whole point. Some tools only work if nobody sees them coming until it's already over. And by the time Dresk Karnholt found out exactly what he'd woken up, it would already be far too late for him to do a single thing about it. 3 hours after the broadcast, the Coalition Council convened an emergency session. Alien delegates from 17 worlds crowded into the chamber, all of them expecting to see human representatives demanding an immediate rescue operation, a show of force, something loud. Instead, the human seat sat empty. A Jean ambassador named Toli Vec leaned toward her aide, antennae twitching with confusion. Where is their representative? This concerns their people directly. The aide had no answer. Nobody did. Human silence during a hostage crisis wasn't just unusual. It was unheard of. And across a dozen alien species that grew up watching how humanity operated, unheard of made people nervous. Humans always showed up loud. Humans always had something to say. Except this time. What the council didn't know was that human silence wasn't absence. It was focus. In an unmarked facility beneath the Nevada desert, a team of 9 operators sat in a briefing room, lit only by the blue glow of tactical displays. These were the Vipers, a joint task force built from the best special operations talent humanity had ever produced, folded together over a decade into something the public had never heard of, and the coalition had never seen in action. Their commander, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Alori, tapped the display, showing Kepler Relay's layout, pulled straight from the original construction blueprints humans had access to, because, as Dresk had bragged, humans built the station. That bragging point was about to become his biggest mistake. "He thinks our station is a liability," Marcus said, voice flat and even. "He doesn't know we designed every inch of it with a contingency built in. Ventilation shafts wide enough for a man in gear. Maintenance tunnels that don't show up on any schematic we handed the coalition. Blind spots in the security grid that only our own engineers know about." One of the operators, a woman named Jess Okafor, cracked her knuckles. "So he's sitting in a house we built, thinking he owns it." "Exactly," Marcus said. And we're about to remind him whose house it actually is. No press releases. No ultimatums shouted back at Dresk. No public negotiation theater for the cameras. Just 9 operators, a decade of quiet preparation, and a plan that had never once involved giving terrorists what they wanted. Somewhere in orbit, Dresk Karnholt kept talking to empty air, waiting for a response that was never, ever coming the way he expected. Dresk Karnholt was not a patient man, and human silence was starting to eat at him. 6 hours had passed since his broadcast. No council response. No human ambassador begging for terms. No fleet posturing at his border, which honestly would have made more sense to him than nothing at all. Nothing was worse than anything. Nothing meant he didn't know what was coming. He paced the command deck of the docking ring, boots clicking against the metal floor, his lieutenants watching him with the kind of nervous energy that spreads fast in small rooms. One of them, a younger Voss fighter named Ket, finally spoke up. "Maybe they're planning something," Ket said. Dresk waved him off. "Humans don't plan quiet. Humans plan loud. Cameras, speeches, threats. This is what they do before they cave. They're scared. And scared people go quiet before they fold." He believed that, genuinely believed it, because every piece of propaganda about humanity he'd consumed painted them as reactive, emotional, prone to grandstanding. He had built his entire strategy around that assumption. What Dresk didn't know, what almost nobody outside a handful of black-budget programs knew, was that humanity had spent the last 10 years quietly studying every hostage crisis, every terror plot, every act of extremism committed against human colonies across a dozen systems. They hadn't just cataloged the attacks, they'd cataloged the patterns behind them, the psychology, the timing, the weak points every single group like the Ashen Hand always shared. And they built the Vipers specifically to exploit those weak points without ever needing to negotiate a single term. Back on the station, hostages sat huddled together in the docking ring, a mix of human engineers, alien traders, and station families who'd been unlucky enough to be present when the Ashen Hand struck. Among them was a maintenance technician named Danny Okuosa, who kept his head down and his mouth shut. But his eyes were doing something the guards hadn't noticed. He was counting guards, counting exits, counting seconds between patrol rotations. Danny had worked on this station for 6 years. He knew every access panel, every blind corner, every ventilation grate that led somewhere. The Ashen Hand hadn't bothered to check because their intel was outdated, pulled from public schematics that hadn't been updated in years. He didn't know help was already on the way, but he was making sure that whenever it arrived, it would find exactly what it needed. Somewhere out in the dark beyond the station's hull, the Viper's stealth transport was already closing the distance, running dark, running silent, running exactly the way humanity had planned this from the very first minute Dresk Karnholt made his demands public. The Ashen Hand struck first, just like Dresk promised they would. 12 hours into the standoff, with still no word from the Coalition Council and no human response, Dresk decided silence needed a push. He ordered his men to drag one of the hostages, an older Coalition trade envoy named Baron Kassal, in front of the cameras. "This is what happens when you ignore me," Dresk said to the broadcast feed, his voice sharp with impatience. Baron was struck once, hard, and the feed cut before anything worse could happen, but the message was clear enough. Dresk wanted panic. He wanted outrage. He wanted someone, anyone, screaming at him to stop. Across a dozen worlds, outrage exploded exactly like he hoped. Alien news networks ran the footage on a loop. Council members demanded action. Protesters gathered outside embassies on 3 different planets, and humanity still said nothing publicly. But underneath that silence, something had already moved. The moment Baron was struck on camera, Marcus Elori's team received their final authorization. 9 operators, dressed in matte black gear with no insignia, boarded a transport that had been drifting silently 200 kilometers from Kepler Relay for the past 4 hours, running so cold and so quiet that Ashen Hand sensors had registered it as debris. "Wheels up," Marcus said into his comm. "We're not here to talk." The transport eased toward the station's underside, toward a maintenance airlock that didn't appear on any schematic the Ashen Hand had access to, because humans had quietly patched that vulnerability out of every public blueprint years earlier without telling a single coalition partner. Call it foresight. Call it paranoia. Either way, it was about to save 300 lives. Inside the docking ring, Danny Okuosa felt the faintest vibration through the floor plating, A sound so subtle that only someone who'd spent 6 years learning every hum and rattle of this station would notice it at all. He allowed himself the smallest smile. "About time," he whispered, low enough that only the hostage beside him heard it. Dresk, still riding high on the reaction his broadcast had gotten, had no idea that the very silence he'd mistaken for weakness had actually been a countdown clock running the entire time. 9 operators were now inside his walls. His fortress had a backdoor humans built on purpose, and he was about to learn exactly why you never trust the blueprints of the people you're trying to hold hostage. Marcus Ilori's team moved through the maintenance tunnels in total darkness. Night vision the only light guiding them, boots silent on grated metal floors that Ashen Hand patrols had never once thought to check. This was the part of the plan the Coalition would never fully understand. Not because it was complicated, but because it wasn't built around firepower at all. Dresk expected a rescue attempt eventually, expected soldiers storming in guns blazing, and he'd stationed his best fighters at every obvious entry point. What he never expected was a team that had already mapped every heartbeat inside his own command structure before setting foot on the station. Because the Vipers hadn't spent the last 12 hours planning an assault. They'd spent it listening. Every comm channel the Ashen Hand used, every private frequency Dresk thought was secure, had been quietly intercepted the moment their fleet dropped out of warp near Kepler Relay. Human intelligence had spent years building tools specifically for this, technology no Coalition partner had ever been shown, developed in the kind of secrecy that made even allied species uneasy when rumors of it surfaced. Marcus knew exactly how many fighters Dresk had. He knew their rotation schedule. He knew which guards were nervous rookies and which ones were hardened veterans. He knew Dresk kept his most valuable hostages closest to himself, using them as a personal shield, confident that no rescue force would risk a firefight that close to civilians. He was right about that. There would be no firefight anywhere near the hostages. "Team 2, you're on the reactor control room," Marcus whispered into his comm. "Team 3, hold position outside the docking ring. Nobody moves until my signal." Jess Okafor crouched near a ventilation grate directly above the docking ring, close enough to hear muffled voices below, close enough to see Danny Okuosa's silhouette through the grating, still counting, still watching, still ready. She caught his eye through the vent for half a second. He gave the smallest possible nod Mace received. Help had arrived, and it hadn't come the way anyone, human or alien, had expected. Meanwhile, on the command deck, Dresk Karnholt was giving another speech to cameras that were no longer transmitting, because human signal engineers had quietly hijacked the broadcast feed 40 minutes earlier and replaced it with a delayed loop, buying the Vipers a critical blind window nobody on the Ashen Hand side even realized existed. Dresk thought the whole galaxy was still watching him. In reality, nobody was watching him at all anymore. Everyone who mattered was already 3 steps ahead, waiting for the exact right second to finish this without a single hostage getting hurt. The signal came at 0417 station time, 4 short pulses through Marcus Ilori's earpiece. And every operator moved at once like a single machine built from 9 different parts. Team 2 hit the reactor control room first, not to sabotage it, but to seize it, cutting off Dresk's ability to threaten a station-wide overload the way his manifesto had promised he would if things went sideways. 2 Ashen Hand engineers went down fast and quiet, zip-tied before they could even reach for their weapons. Team 3 breached the docking ring's outer hatch using a cutting tool designed specifically for human-grade alloy, slicing through in under 6 seconds, fast enough that the guards inside barely had time to turn around. Inside the docking ring, chaos erupted, but it was chaos on the Viper's terms, not Dresk's. Jess Okafor dropped through the ceiling vent first, weapon already tracking, and put down the 2 guards closest to the hostages before either of them could raise an alarm. Danny Okuosa, without needing to be told, grabbed the woman beside him and pulled her flat against the floor, shouting the same 3 words to everyone nearby. "Stay down, now!" 300 hostages hit the deck together like they'd rehearsed it, which in a way they had, because Danny had spent the last 12 hours quietly passing whispered instructions down the line, preparing them for exactly this moment without any of them fully understanding why. The remaining Ashen Hand fighters inside the docking ring never stood a chance. Trained soldiers who'd spent years fighting scattered militia skirmishes suddenly found themselves up against operators who moved like they'd already lived through this exact scenario 100 times in simulation. Because they had, within 90 seconds, the docking ring was clear. On the command deck, Dress Carnholt finally realized something was wrong when his guard channel went dead silent all at once. He grabbed his weapon, spun toward the door, and found himself staring down the barrel of Marcus Ilori's rifle, the American operator standing calm and unhurried in the doorway like he had all the time in the world. "You wanted to talk to humanity," Marcus said, voice low and even. "Congratulations. You've got our full attention now." Dresk's hand twitched toward his own weapon, and for one heartbeat the entire station seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere below, 300 hostages lay flat against the deck, hearts pounding, waiting to find out whether the last 16 hours had actually ended or whether things were about to get a whole lot worse. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. The whole standoff came down to one warlord, one twitching hand, and one operator who had already made peace with how this was going to go long before he ever stepped onto this station. Dress Carnholt made the wrong call, the same wrong call desperate men have made throughout history when they finally realize the ground has shifted beneath them. He fired first, Marcus didn't. He didn't need to. The shot went wide, deflected off a plated bulkhead installed specifically to absorb small arms fire, another quiet detail from the original human blueprints that Dresk had never bothered to study. Before Dresk could line up a second shot, Marcus closed the distance in 2 fast steps and put him flat on the deck, weapon kicked away, wrists bound before the Voss warlord even fully understood he'd lost. "Command deck secure," Marcus said into his comm, voice steady like he was reporting a routine drill instead of the end of a hostage crisis that had gripped a dozen worlds for the past 16 hours. Across the station, the last pockets of ashen hand resistance folded fast once word spread that their leader had been taken. A handful of fighters tried to barricade themselves near the fuel bay, but with the reactor control room already secure and their communications cut, they had no plan, no leadership, and no way out. They surrendered within the hour. Outside the station, the Coalition Council fleet that had spent the last 16 hours arguing over authorization protocols and diplomatic procedure finally arrived. Guns hot, ready for a battle that had already ended 2 hours earlier, without a single coalition vote ever being cast. Tali Vek, the Jean ambassador, watched the reports come in from her command chair, antennae drooping in something close to disbelief. "They didn't wait for us," she said quietly. "They didn't wait for anyone." Her aide had no response to that either, because there wasn't one that made sense within the usual rules of how the coalition operated. Every other species built consensus before acting. Humans, apparently, built solutions in the dark and only told anyone about it once the problem was already handled. Back inside the docking ring, medics moved through the crowd of shaken but alive hostages, checking injuries, handing out blankets and water. Danny Okwosa sat against the wall, adrenaline finally draining out of him, watching Jess Okafor help an elderly coalition traitor to her feet with more gentleness than he expected from someone who'd just taken down armed guards without hesitation. "Took you guys long enough," Danny said, managing a tired grin. Jess glanced over, matching his grin with one of her own. "We were being polite. Wanted to let him finish his speech first." Somewhere behind them, Dresk Carnholt sat cuffed on the floor of his own command deck, finally understanding exactly what humanity's silence had actually meant. News of Kepler Relay's liberation broke across every coalition network within the hour, and the reaction wasn't relief so much as stunned confusion. Nobody had announced a rescue mission. Nobody had seen a fleet mobilize. Nobody had watched soldiers board a transport on any public feed. As far as most of the galaxy was concerned, 300 hostages had simply gone from captive to free, with no visible military operation in between, like the entire crisis had been resolved by something that didn't officially exist. Because in a very real sense, it hadn't. The Vipers had no public record, no official designation in any coalition military database. Marcus Ilori and his team boarded their transport, cleared the area before the coalition fleet even docked, and were gone before a single alien reporter could get so much as a blurry photo. By the time official statements started circulating, all anyone had to go on was a brief, almost bored press release from the human delegation. "The situation at Kepler Relay has been resolved. All hostages are safe. The individual responsible is in custody. Humanity does not negotiate with terrorists." 6 sentences. No press conference, no victory speech. No footage released for public consumption. It was, by every measure the coalition understood, the least dramatic ending imaginable to what should have been one of the most dramatic crises in recent memory. And that, more than anything, was what rattled people. Talivek requested a private meeting with the human delegation the following day, hoping for answers, for some explanation of how this had happened so fast, so quietly, so completely. What she got instead was Admiral Elena Reyes, calm, polite, giving almost nothing away. "We had assets in position," Reyes said simply. "We used them. That's it?" Talivek asked. "No further explanation?" Reyes allowed the faintest smile. "Ambassador, with respect." The Ashen Hand thought loud threats would force quiet fear out of us. They were operating on old assumptions about how humanity responds to pressure. We let them keep believing that assumption right up until it stopped mattering. Word of that meeting spread fast through diplomatic circles, whispered between species who'd spent decades thinking they understood exactly what humanity was and wasn't capable of. The old assumption that humans were loud, reactive, prone to grandstanding under pressure quietly started dying that week. A new assumption began replacing it, one that would follow humanity into every future conflict across the galaxy. They don't threaten. They don't posture. They just show up, finish it, and go home without saying much of anything at all. In the weeks that followed, Dres-Karnholt stood trial before a joint coalition tribunal, the first major test of an alliance that included human representation on equal footing with a dozen other species. He tried at first to paint himself as a freedom fighter pushed to extremes, tried to argue that humanity's border policies had left his people with no other options. It might have worked on a different audience, on a species less familiar with the specifics of what he'd actually done. But the tribunal had testimony from 300 hostages, footage from station security systems the Ashen Hand never knew existed, and a full accounting of exactly how far Dresk had been willing to go to get what he wanted. The verdict wasn't close. But the bigger story, the one that spread across every coalition world in the months after Kepler Relay, wasn't really about Dres-Karnholt at all anymore. It was about what humanity had revealed about itself in those 16 hours of silence. Species that had spent decades treating humans as capable but unpredictable allies, useful in a fight but hard to read, started paying much closer attention. Military analysts across a dozen worlds pored over every scrap of public information about the Vipers, finding almost nothing, which unsettled them more than finding everything would have. Danny Okwuosa went back to work on Kepler Relay 2 weeks after the crisis, back to fixing conduits and running diagnostics like nothing had happened. Except now station kids sometimes pointed him out in the corridors, whispering that he was the guy who kept everyone calm during the takeover. He never made a big deal out of it. He just kept doing his job the same way he had before, because that was the whole point. Life kept moving forward. That was the win. Jess Okafor and the rest of the Viper team went back into the shadows they'd come from. No medals, no public recognition, no interviews. That was the deal. The same deal it had always been. They didn't do this for credit. They did it because it needed doing, and because humanity had decided a long time ago that the answer to terror would never be a negotiating table. Admiral Elena Reyes gave exactly one more public statement on the matter, closing out the entire incident in front of the Coalition Council with the same calm, unhurried tone she'd used in every conversation since. "Some of you have asked what changed. Why humanity responded the way we did," she said. "Nothing changed. This is what we've always been capable of. You just hadn't needed to see it yet." A year later, Kepler Relay stood exactly where it always had, humming with traffic from a dozen species, docking bays full, corridors busy, no visible scar left from the 16 hours that had once made it the center of galactic attention. Danny Okwuosa still worked maintenance, though these days he trained new technicians too, always making sure they knew every inch of the station the way he did. Every shaft, every panel, every blind corner, because you never knew when knowing your own home better than anyone else might matter again. Admiral Elena Reyes sat in a quiet office on Earth, reading reports from a dozen border systems, all of them noticeably calmer than they'd been the year before. Word had spread fast among extremist factions across coalition space. Humanity did not negotiate, did not posture, did not bluff. When they went quiet, that silence meant something was already in motion, and by the time anyone realized it, the situation would already be over. Threats against human colonies dropped sharply that year. Not because humanity had grown louder or more aggressive, but because they'd proven, once, decisively, exactly what their silence actually meant, and no one wanted to test it twice. Marcus Ilori and the Vipers never got statues, never got their names printed in any history book the public could access. They went on to other assignments in other systems, quiet as always, doing the work nobody saw so that ordinary people, human and alien alike, never had to. Toli Vec, the Jean ambassador, kept a single line from Admiral Reyes pinned above her desk for the rest of her career. A reminder of the day her understanding of an entire species changed for good. This is what we've always been capable of. You just hadn't needed to see it yet. Across a dozen worlds, in spars and briefing rooms and classrooms teaching coalition history, the story of Kepler Relay got told and retold, growing a little in the telling the way stories always do. But the core of it never changed, because the core of it didn't need embellishing. Terrorists wanted humanity to negotiate. Humanity sent 9 operators, a decade of quiet preparation, and a message that didn't need a single word of it broadcast to the galaxy. They didn't beg, they didn't bow, they didn't blink. They just finished it, went home, and let the silence speak for itself. And out among the stars, every faction that ever thought about testing humanity again remembered exactly what happened the last time somebody tried. They remembered, and they stayed quiet instead.